This week, our second annual listeners episode of the podcast, we answer all of your questions, which you sent in to books@nytimes.com and tweeted at us and posted online in other ways, shapes, and forms, and we answer. First up, a critic segment with Dwight Garner and his editor, John Williams. We will then be joined by two editors at the book review, Lauren Christensen and MJ Franklin. And finally, our two intrepid publishing reporters, Liz Harris and Alexandra Alter, will also answer questions. Today is January 7th. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Starting us off, our critic, Dwight Garner, is joined by his editor, John Williams. Hey there.
Hi, Pamela. Hey, John.
Hey, Pamela. Hey, Dwight.
All right, let us start with some questions from our listeners. We have an email that came from Francis Martinez, and he writes, I was thinking how many times I have heard discussions of one-hit wonders in music, one smash hit and then gone, and I was wondering if the same thing exists in literature. Harper Lee comes to mind, but she chose not to publish another book. What authors debuted with a smash and never replicated that success?
There are a lot of them, don't you think, John?
There must be a ton of them, yeah. Two or three come immediately to mind. Well, Margaret Mitchell, much like Harper Lee, chose to only publish Gone with the Wind. And certainly commercially, that was a giant smash. When I think of one hit wonder, I usually think of, a lot of popular success. Because another person who comes to mind who for a long time seemed like she might be that way was Marilynne Robinson, who published her first novel, I think it was 1988. And then I think it was 16 or 17 years later that she published Gilead, and then has kind of interestingly become prolific since then and has published 3 other novels since Gilead.
I think my favorite one-hit wonder is John Kennedy O'Toole, who wrote Confederacy of Dunces, which is such a wacky novel. And I spent a few months this year in New Orleans, so I read it again in preparation for traveling down there. Because it's the ultimate New Orleans novel, the main character, this sort of dyspeptic, overweight, intellectual madman, sells hot dogs in the French Quarter. It's part of the plot. And I'm sorry to say, doesn't really hold up. I mean, the first half is so charming, it's just amazing. But in the second half, it just kind of gets all over the place. One of my friends described this kind of book as like a squid novel. Like the top is very shapely, then it becomes all these little, arms at the bottom that don't quite hold together.
That's a great phrase.
That way. Like I read that book, I feel like around the same time I read The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, which I think holds together better, as a whole, but it still has that same problem of like it's so wild and crazy and funny and strange in the first half, and then I don't know.
Yeah, I like squid books. But I remember even the only time I read Confederacy, which was a very long time ago, kind of feeling like it was very funny and I liked the voice and it was rollicking, but it was a little bit like a soft pudding, that just falls all over the place.
Yeah. And as we know, it's a sad story. The author committed suicide and he was clearly, just so incredibly talented that you wonder what he would have gone on to do, which is the big tragedy with that novel.
But I also feel like Ignatius Reilly, right? Is that his name?
Yeah,
it's like one of the great Bartleby figures in literature, just those people that just refuse.
One of my favorite lines from that novel, he's selling hot dogs, and he likes to sort of intellectually puff himself up. He considers the costumes he has to wear, or the outfit, the uniform. He pretends they're academic robes, and he likes selling hot dogs from their little warm bucket of water because he thinks that it's like a customer choosing their own lobster, choose your own dog. And it's funny. Like, it's just really good.
That's disturbing. Hot dog water is one of the most disturbing phrases in the language.
Can you imagine? Like, that's the kind of, thing that as a teenager, you'd be like, how much would I have to pay you to drink a gallon of hot dog water?
Yeah, I find we'll do some more research on this because I feel like the more famous people are those who just didn't publish that much. It wasn't that they had one hit and then had a bunch of mediocre stuff after that. It was more just like the Harper Lees and the Ralph Ellisons and people who didn't produce a lot of work, but what they did produce was great.
Yeah, and so many writers, publish a novel that's kind of a hit early, and then they just kind of vanish into what we used to call anyway the mid-list. They just kind of never kind of reach that level of popularity again, and it can almost seem like they've gone away.
Well, there's also something a bit unfair about the expectations that they set up for themselves. Like I'm thinking of someone like, I guess when she wrote The Goldfinch, Donna Tartt blew this theory out of the water. But for a while, she wrote The Secret History and it was this giant commercial and critical success. And then she did write a couple of books after that. And I'm sure they did fine and they had their fans. But when you create a cultural moment like that, it's, you're setting the bar quite high.
Absolutely.
All right, here are a couple of questions from Paul Lester in Houston, Texas. The first thing he asks is the term cloth-bound obsolete, eclipsed by hardback? Actually, I think hardback is also maybe obsolete. He says, Miss Smoot, my high school English teacher, instructed her pupils, perhaps another extinct term, that books are properly classified as either cloth-bound or paperback, and that hardback is simply incorrect. What say ye?
I would never disagree with Miss Smoot about anything.
This person is in Houston? This sounds like a very British question. I always called them hardcovers when I was in publishing, but I think clothbound is a publishing term. They still use it on the fact sheets for their books in-house. It says paper and cloth.
And I'm still old enough to remember working in bookstores. I worked in a lot of them when I was in high school and college and just after I graduated from college. And, this was before the internet. And so you would have no one, maybe a few listeners will remember, anyone who worked in bookstores, but you would have these microfiche sheets from distributors like Baker and Taylor was one of them, with the name of it. And there was another famous book distributor. And you had to order, of course, you work in a mall bookstore, you make all orders sound really difficult. It's a special order. It's not just an order. So you have to get this microfiche out and you look through the microfiche for the copy. Can I order it? Can I not? And then you have two options, and it would always say cloth or paper. So in my mind, I still remember cloth really well, but I haven't used it for a long time.
Cloth to me is a real industry term. I don't think I ever knew that term until I worked in publishing, but I always just call them hardcovers and paperbacks.
Me too.
All right. Miss Smoot would disapprove. Miss Smoot also said that ending a sentence with the preposition at was wrong. And our friend Paul Lester wants to know, is ending a sentence with a preposition at now accepted usage?
John, you want to take this one? You're the editor here.
Oh, God, this is where I confess. I am terrible at grammar. To the extent that I can write or edit, it's all just by having read so much. I don't know the rules at all. I know enough to know that if I saw at with a period after it, you need to pause there. And unless it was a real stylist who was just doing his thing or her thing, I would try to avoid that. But less because of some rule, because it seems a little ungainly to me.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Joan Didion saying that for her, grammar was like a piano that I play by ear, meaning she didn't necessarily know every language rule, but she knew when a sentence sounded bad. And I think that's where we both live. Rules are meant to be broken if it adds to the liveliness of the language, I think.
Paul Lester's example is a question like, where will the new house be built at? Which, is like fingers on a chalkboard to me. But then if you put it maybe in an accent, you think, oh, maybe that's a regionalism.
It could be. In that particular case, again, the sound you don't need the at.
I got Southern friends always asking me where y'all at. So, I'll give them that one.
Yeah, maybe in quotes.
There you go.
All right, here we go. Our next question comes from Twitter, and it is Khaled Halak who asks, who, in your opinion, is the best travelogue writer of the past 50 years or so, and why?
Travelogue? You mean just simply travel writer?
Yes.
Oh,
I'll let Dwight go first. I think he reads a lot more travel than I do.
Well, I've said this even recently on this podcast, and I'm a huge fan of genres that are slightly off the beaten path, and travel writing is absolutely one of those. I just think it's a great form because it's always fresh. It's always new. You can always make of it. It's permanently interesting to go somewhere and describe what you see. Travel writing is going through something right now. And I've been rereading, for example, a lot of my favorite travel books, like by Paul Theroux, for example, who's a wonderful writer. But Paul Theroux, he's an equal opportunity misanthropist. I mean, he's a misogynist. He's horrible, in a great way, though. I mean, he hates everybody. He hates everybody.
That's right.
But you could never get away with traveling through third world countries, poor countries, and just laying down bombs like he does about everything that he sees. It's just not going to happen anymore. So travel writing is reached a place where this sort of white elite gaze is not going to do in the way that it did for a long time. Having said that, a lot of Theroux stuff is just some of the most brilliant writing I've ever read. And ditto with Diane Johnson, who has a travel book. In the title, there's the word opium in it. I can't remember. Natural Opium, I believe it's called, is just a great, great book. John, who do you have? I'm trying to think who else that I really love.
I'll throw in a couple.
Please.
All right. Also in the Paul Theroux school of completely offensive and obnoxious and would never be published today. And yet I think Redmond O'Hanlon's books are really funny.
Yep.
In Trouble Again and Into the Heart of Borneo, I really loved. I'm sure those books will make people upset and angry as well. I think Jan Morris is really great. And I also love Pico Iyer's travel writing.
Pico Iyer's great. I just reread Jan Morris's Venice book. Oh man, it's funny. She's one of those writers who, I don't know, it's just always down the tip of her tongue. There's never sort of a dull sentence. I don't know how she manages to do it. Or he, at that point, I believe it was, but anyway.
She gave good email too. Wow. I feel like everyone who got to email with her, there should be like the collected emails of Jan Morris.
Oh, have you saved all your emails, Pamela? This is a tangent, but we can go here, can't we?
Yeah. It's hard to save all your emails because the systems keep changing. You know, I never deleted my Yahoo emails, but then it turned out that Yahoo deleted my Yahoo emails. And it looks like Google is on the same mission. So I've got to figure it out. Actually,
I'm heartbroken because as some listeners will know, I was an editor at the Book Review for a decade or so. And I had kept this file that said, just save me, like great emails from great writers, name it, Updike, Jan Morris. And I had this whole file of hundreds, maybe even thousands. And then just in the process of upgrading, they're all googly-gook now. I mean, I can't read them. And it's a bummer.
That's
I feel like
horrible.
History is just lost.
Dwight, that's so depressing.
No. Anyway, that was a tangent.
I feel like travel writers are people I still need to get to. I've certainly read some, but I don't have firmly held opinions. I think it might be related to the fact that I was kind of a late traveler in my life. I've come to love it, but I come from sort of non-travelers, and it took me a while to get the bravery up to hop around. So
I think the book that started it for me was On the Road. I mean, Kerouac, it's a novel, but it's based on a lot of his own trips. And I think that made me feel like, to know America anyway, you had to sort of get out.
Yeah, if we add road trips to the category, then I guess there might be some more options.
On the Road.
Oh, Pamela.
I'm sorry. Oh. I hated that book.
Well, when was the last time you read it, Dwight? It might be like school. Confederacy of Dunces. I don't know.
I reread it. Actually, I reread The Scroll recently, and I still loved it. But I also, frankly, Joyce Johnson's memoir about knowing Kerouac, I almost like more than On the Road. So.
That is one of my favorite books. I love that book. It's called Minor Characters.
Yep.
Let's pass things over to Brianna Lind from El Cerrito, California. She writes a very long and interesting email, but I'm going to get to the heart of it here. She said the book that made her write this email is David Michaelis' recent biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, and that she adores Eleanor Roosevelt and had such high hopes, but was terribly disappointed, did not finish. Okay, here she says, here's her question. With that in mind, I would absolutely love to hear about some of your and your staff's favorite biographies as examples of biography, and not merely because they are about an interesting person.
Well, I'm going to start by saying poor David Michaelis. I was rereading some John Updike review of one of his previous biographies of Charles Schulz, and Updike scolds him for getting a golf fact wrong. I thought, wow, that's really getting into the nitty gritty. But John, you go. What do you got?
Well, I don't read a lot of like big historical sort of great man biographies. I've read some of Caro's LBJ books, and I tend to read more literary biographies. I've bored people with this before, but I really love the biographer Robert D. Richardson, who died last year. And his books about Emerson and Thoreau are very good. But I think his William James book, not just because I'm a big fan of James, but because to me, it was the most narratively satisfying biography I think I've ever read, partly because James had this great family between Henry and his sister Alice, and you get not just William, but kind of the whole constellation. And the way Richardson tells the story is, he starts you without the dry 40 pages of his great-great-great-grandfather who was born on a farm, and that kind of stuff makes me glaze over. So he just puts you right into the middle of the action where you want to be about the person you're actually interested in learning about. So I think that's a brilliant book.
Yeah, I kind of have a rule as a reader. I mean, it's a flexible rule, but if after 40 pages of a biography, I'm not at least approaching the career, you don't have to be, like I said, there's a lot of, sometimes writers have very interesting childhoods and it takes longer. But if I'm not approaching the start of what made them interesting, by 40 pages, I'm starting to think this is going on a little long. God, but I got to go with a couple classics, only in the sense that Boswell's Life of Johnson, it's so charming. Of Samuel Johnson is so charming on every page, and indeed, it's because Samuel Johnson was charming. Boswell is charming himself. He was equal to Johnson, and what makes that book so great. In a totally different vein, I think we've talked about this book before, but Andre Agassi's. Well, no, that's an autobiography. Yeah. It's not a biography. I will say Claire Tomlin's biography of Samuel Pepys is really, really well written, as are Peter Guralnick's Elvis books. And I
love those books. Yeah.
I like his one more about Sam Phillips almost than the Elvis books. I'm not sure I need how many volumes was the
Elvis?
There
were 2, but they were both dense.
Yeah, I mean, I get why Elvis matters, but I don't need to read that much about Elvis. When I was in high school, I loved this book. It was a biography of Jim Morrison. It was called No One Here Gets Out Alive by Jerry Hopkins. And at the time, I thought, this is what a biography
Oh,
should
yeah,
be.
I haven't heard about that one in a long time. Yeah, I would second, I might have liked the Elvis books a little bit more than Dwight, but they're a real chore. I mean, you have to devote a lot of time to them. And another classic, he mentioned Claire Tomlin, and in her vein, Hermione Lee's biography of Virginia Woolf is rightfully considered one of the best of all time. And I really love also group biographies and biographies that are maybe more organized by an idea than by one life. And the one that comes to mind is Paul Eli's The Life You Save May Be Your Own, which is a sort of group biography of Dorothy Day and Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy and one other Catholic writer I'm forgetting. So I apologize.
Wow, I've forgotten about that book. I need to find that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic book.
Okay, I'm going to actually ask a question, given that last bit from the two of you, from Damara, who hails from Brisbane, Australia. She wants to know how many books you all read each year and what proportion are for work or for pleasure. And now so do I, because you've both obviously read a lot.
Well, I like to have about 3 or 4 books going at once. One for work. I always have one in the bathroom. You have to have one in the bathroom. You know, if you omit that, you're losing about 4 books a year probably. Yeah, I just have them by my bed. I mean, I have different books in different places. One in the car because you get stuck somewhere.
But you must average a couple of books a week at least, given your job.
Yeah, probably. And if you factor in cookbooks, which I'm always reading, and books about food, and I don't know.
Right.
But it's funny. People ask me all the time. Do you read really quickly? And I don't think I do. I mean, I read probably a bit quicker than the average person, but I'm not a speed reader by a long shot. And I tell them, I'm lucky enough to get paid to read for the most part. And if you have 8 hours a day, that's your time allotted to work, you can read most books in 8 hours. It's rare that I sit down and read a book in a day because it's really taxing. But
you could do it if you had to.
I could do it if I had to.
I'm similar. I probably read on average somewhere like a couple of books a week. And most of it is for what I would call kind of a mix of pleasure and work. I'm always trying to, find things that keep building the foundation of what I know about things in some kind of semi-directed way. And then, of course, I read probably at least a couple of dozen books every year specifically for work. So that's it. And I'm a pretty fast reader, but definitely not a speed reader. I mean, there are these people online who read literally, 300 books a year. I don't quite know how that happens.
One of the curses of our profession, I'm sure Pamela and John, you'll agree, is that I tend to have read the first third of half the books that are published this year, because I'm trying to find the stuff to review for myself. And so I pick almost everything up and look at it and give it a shot. And for a long time, as I said earlier, I worked at the book review. And part of your job as a book review editor is to read things and decide if they're worth reviewing, but you can't read everything. And so you would read a big chunk and decide based on that chunk. So I've read the first 70 pages of 1,000 books.
Yes.
And you end up pretending you've read them. Oh, yes, I read that.
But did you ever read any, like a big chunk, say this isn't worth reviewing, and then later be like, oh my God, actually that book turned out to be great. It got stellar reviews. I totally tossed it to the side based on that first chunk.
All the time. No, not all the time, but at least a couple of times a year, More often what happens is you get really excited early and then it becomes horrible.
All right, here's a question from Winifred Chow related to that. I assume the critics are assigned books to review. How do critics deal with a book they absolutely dislike to the point where they cannot continue reading it? Do the critics quit reading? Do the critics bite the tongue and endure to the end? I ask these questions because I have never read a review that is 100% negative.
Well, the first part of that is wrong, and I'll let Dwight handle that. But also, we have some links to send her if she'd like to read 100% negative reviews.
God, it's funny. Even with a monster-sized book, if I start reviewing it and I know I've got to review it, maybe it's by a major writer, I never even skip a single paragraph, only because I want to be decisive in my reviews. I want to say not once does he mention his mother, and if there's once and I missed it, I'm going to be really upset. Reading a terrible book can be sort of exciting in a funny way, especially if it's by a major writer, because, a major writer can take a negative review. When you feel sort of low as a critic, and one thing I never want to do is review a big book negatively by a writer you've never heard of, because what's the point,
Well, Dwight and I have talked about this. Essentially, Dwight, you 99% of the time, we might put something on your radar that then you decide to do, but you're picking the things you write. So I suppose you're saying that it takes a major writer for you to even want to write a negative review, and otherwise you're looking for things that would be mixed to positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And, God, I often reach this place reading a book where I just want to drop it behind the couch and forget I even started it,
But isn't that sometimes like a public service to readers to say, like, hey, this thing you've been hearing all about, it's actually no good at all?
Oh, absolutely. I think about that a lot, how much of many people have said it, but one of the duties of a daily book critic at any rate is to, give people enough information about it to talk about it a bit without having read it. I mean, I don't like to think of that being, it's not one of my prime motivations, but you do want to provide readers with a sense of what a book is about, enough for them to sort of navigate the conversation about it.
I think the service angle comes in to the extent that it does when, to your point, Pamela, something is getting a ton of attention or selling 1 million copies. I think if there's a debut novel that's going to sell 200 copies and the only way most people are going to hear about it is if Dwight says this is horrible, then it can feel like kind of swerving out of your way to hit a deer or something. But there are always glitzy debuts that everyone's talking about, and sometimes those books are overinflated and it can feel like your job to kind of say, what are you all talking about?
Big books are funny. I mean, people love to buy them, and you wonder if they always read them. I remember back in the 90s, I think, Michael Kinsley, writing for the New Republic, there were a lot of sort of mega trend or major intellectual bestsellers that year, like Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time. And Michael Kinsley had some of his staffers go and slip little notes, like the size of, like fortune cookie notes, and said, if you've reached this page, call this number and I'll send you $50, And he put them in hundreds of copies and no one ever called. So you wonder,
Well, you don't wonder after that experiment,
right,
know.
Right.
1 out of every 1,000 people is reading the Hawking book.
All right, here is a question from Michelle Trope. She's actually talking about one of our colleagues on the book review side, Dave Kim, who is on vacation at the moment and so cannot address this himself. But on a recent podcast episode, he did not get an opportunity to answer my question about his top picks for the sub-genre of the banal creep of mortality. He may have avoided the question, actually, Michelle, but we will now pose it to John and Dwight. John, I think you were on that segment.
Yes, I think I was. I forget exactly what book we were talking about. But, I have a good friend who many years ago said that all books were on some level about writing. And I think that maybe all books are on some level about the creep of mortality. How could they not be? But I think the more specific ones, there's a novel I read a couple of years ago by a Canadian writer named Margaret Lawrence. I loved one of her books more than this, so I followed it up with a book that I think is maybe a little bit more well-known called The Stone Angel. And that's about a woman who is essentially aging into the point into her 90s where she's going to have to be taken care of. And so her fight to not be put in a nursing home, and we see her go from sort of sharp and stubborn to a bit confused, and we kind of go through that process through the narrative. And I felt like it wasn't so much the slow creep as the maybe slightly quicker creep, but you don't really read much about the elderly. So in fiction, I don't think. Do you, Dwight?
What was that great, was it Penelope Lively who wrote that book, Memento Mori?
Oh, that's Muriel Spark.
Oh, that was Muriel Spark, which was about the elderly.
And William Trevor has had some of his early novels, I think, were about older people. But I don't know, the creep of mortality. There's a great book about...
And you're forgetting the word banal, which may be banal. I can't decide how to pronounce it.
Right.
How do you say it?
I say banal.
Me too.
All right.
But Dwight, do you have anything that comes to mind?
Well, no, but I'm absolutely with you. I think you could analyze every book ever written under the heading, banal creep of mortality, even children's books probably, But some of the best writing I've read about aging and sort of raging about it is the late Philip Roth novels, I get the sense that Philip Roth really hates being dead. He just hates it. He's like bitter. He's bitter in his grave.
I want to read a novel by Philip Roth in the grave about how much he hates it.
You know who's going to write one is Joyce Carol Oates, because she started writing like the second she left the birth canal, and she's going to keep going. I think she'll be faxing her agent from the grave.
Yeah, she might be writing 1 book a year instead of 2 after she dies, but that's about it in terms of a slowdown.
But one good book, I'll just name one because I really do think it's one of those topics that it's sort of bottomless. But Sigrid Nunez's last novel, I think it was called What Are You Going Through Today, was about an elderly friend, quasi-based on Susan Sontag, who was facing her death from cancer.
But even her earlier novel, The Friend, which was about younger people and involved a character's suicide, was very much about the shadow of mortality and whether or not it was worth going on in a philosophical way.
Exactly. But I've been reading some Isaac Bashevis Singer stuff recently, and God, he is like death haunted, Ditto John Cheever, ditto Lucia Berlin's short stories.
Cheever's journals are great for that too.
Oh God, Cheever's journals are the darkest book you can almost ever read. Anyway, yeah, that's a good one.
Since we're here, I'll just throw in, because it's not about the banal creeping of mortality, it's a much more tragic story, but there's this great, essentially mid-century, a little post-mid-century novel by Peter de Vries called The Blood of the Lamb. And he was sort of a comic writer who wrote all these novels that now are mostly forgotten. He wrote a bunch of them that were pretty light, and he wrote for The New Yorker. They were very literary, but they didn't really stick to the ribs that much. But The Blood of the Lamb, which I think was semi-autobiographical, was about a character whose child gets sick and dies, and about him sort of raging against God because he had been religious, and now he's dealing with, and it's just a pretty extraordinary performance of like dealing with the fact that life is temporary.
I haven't read that de Vries, but I think that he's about to have a moment again. I'm pretty sure I heard through the grapevine that the Library of America is going to bring out a volume or two of de Vries' stuff. So maybe he'll be back on the radar soon. We can
Interesting.
hope.
We didn't actually get through all the questions for you on the critic side, but I think we will close for now and continue with those questions another time.
Let's do it again.
Yes. All right, Dwight, John, thanks so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Lauren Christensen and MJ Franklin, two editors and my colleagues at the Book Review, join us now. Hey, guys.
Hi. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for being here. All right, we have got some questions. These come from our listeners and our readers. They sent us questions in via email and tweets and Instagram and other ways. And our first question comes from Tarja Ernio. She writes, I work at the Finnish Embassy in Washington, D.C., and we have a small book club here with my colleagues. We've decided to tackle American literature by going through it by states in alphabetical order. We are now in Connecticut. We find a couple of books by authors who have been, lived, worked in the current state, pick various books, vote, and then read and discuss. We have read books from Angelou, Didion, and Twain, among others. While I was listening to your series about the history of the Book Review, it came to me that it would be fun to write and ask recommendations for our book club, like in the olden days. So what would you recommend to expats living in the U.S. who want to learn more about American literature? What books or authors would you like to introduce us to? Some of us have moved here recently, and some of us, like me, have been here longer. Not to worry, we're not expecting a list of 52 books, but we would be excited to have any number of recommendations from you. So let's start with you, MJ. What's on your list of recommendations for Tarja and her book club at the Finnish Embassy?
I love this question. I think this is such a fantastic way to explore American literature and like to ground literature in place and to make it real and alive to you. And so this was really fun for me to think about books. So one of the things that I thought of first was James Baldwin and his portrait of Black America, and specifically New York and Harlem. I set a goal for myself to read through all of James Baldwin's work just because he's been so pivotal. And one of his first books, Go Tell It on the Mountain, is an incredible portrait of a young boy coming of age in a religious family in Harlem. It is harrowing and smart, and it really kind of brings you into what New York City, what Harlem meant for a Black family. Similarly, thinking about Toni Morrison and her novel Sula, I also read that for the first time this year. And being pulled into Toni Morrison's Ohio is, I'm speechless just at how she guides you through what the Black community means. And in this world, it is, you're kind of in this one Black neighborhood, and you're seeing how family dynamics are at play, how one woman is empowered, and how she wants to find her own agency in this community that does not provide a lot of agency to women. So those were a few that came to mind. And then also I started thinking about some contemporary novels as well. I think that a lot of times when we're trying to look through or explore America through literature, we kind of go back to some of the classics. But I think there are a lot of contemporary novels that do a spectacular job of kind of like grounding us in this American space. One of the first was the story collection Lot by Brian Washington. And just exploring Brian Washington's South is just an incredible place to be, and how he writes about the atmosphere and especially the food is so critical. I also thought about Celeste Ng's Little Fires Everywhere. Also, I believe in Ohio, I think that's in Shaker Heights. But looking at Celeste Ng deconstruct the power dynamics of a small suburban neighborhood and all of the quiet tensions there is so rich. And you get a different portrait of America than if you were to look just back in time. It kind of helps round out the time frame and the scope we have when we explore the American landscape. So those are some of the few suggestions that I had. Lauren, did you have any?
Yeah, MJ, you took Brian Washington right out of my mouth. I think the way he brings Houston, Texas to the page is so vivid. And one of the things that I loved most about this question was it really just brought to mind my favorite family stories, because I think those are, particularly poignant when they are really rooted, as you said, MJ, in a very specific place. And one that came to mind set in Louisiana was The Yellow House by Sarah Broom, a contemporary, really a biography, but of a house, which was the house that the author Sarah M. Broom grew up in with her many siblings and her mother. And, of course, it's a history of not just a state, not just a city, but a very specific structure within those cities that really tells the story of America. And another novel that I had thought of was Sing Unburied Sing, Jesmond Ward's Mississippi novel. And then, Kansas, Ben Lerner's trilogy, especially the Topeka School, but if it is an autofictional 3-part story of a boy man who is very closely based on the author himself, who was born in Topeka, Kansas. So yeah, it's a fascinating question, and thank you for asking it.
All right, we will give our next question over to Sharon Hamilton, who writes in via email. Are there any happy, empowering novels about women in their prime? I turned 50 this year and quickly discovered, as many women have discovered before me, that this is the invisible age. Professional women in their prime don't appear in movies and don't appear in novels unless in both cases it is as satirical figures meant to be belittled. For a perfect example of this in film recently, see Wes Anderson's appalling French Dispatch. I know there are lots of novels about suffering parents, and there are definitely a lot of novels about women being cheated on in midlife, but which are the happy, empowering novels for us?
The Tom Perrotta novel, Mrs. Fletcher, was a really fantastic example of a heroine whose, middle age does not stop her from being the real, center of a lot of excitement and pathos and interest that is in no way pitying or disadvantaged. So I love that novel.
MJ, what about you?
This doesn't totally answer your question because it's not necessarily an overtly happy book, but it's not a book where tragedy just heaps itself upon the characters. But I thought of Modern Lovers by Emma Straub. It's a book about a group of friends who are in the next stage of their lives. They used to be in a band together, and now they're growing up, they have families, and they're just trying to figure out how they fit into each other's lives. Emma Straub renders their considerations so thoughtfully, and it's a book that, though not explicitly happy, really just kind of paints a portrait of someone figuring out modern life. So that came to mind. I'm sorry I don't have more answers of happy novels. I think I have some soul searching to do about the heaviness of what I'm reading.
Yeah, it's not often that I hear our colleagues discussing books that are inspiring. So, Sharon, I am very sorry. We are an uninspired dark group, but perhaps we will come up with some other recommendations for you next year. I actually have another question that came in through Twitter. It's a really basic question, but people want to know this all the time. This comes from Arista, and she or he asks, how do you assign reviewers?
I love this question because how we assign reviewers is like the fun part of the job. It's like playing books matchmaker. And one of the things I think about a lot is just who do I want to talk to about a book at hand? Who around will have something thoughtful, interesting, surprising to say that helps me understand the book a little bit better and hopefully helps connect the book in whatever way, shape, or form with readers.
I think all of us have different ways of going about this. Lauren, how about you? How do you choose a reviewer?
Well, I agree with MJ that it's absolutely the most fun part of the job, that all of our reviewers are really kind of working with us on a freelance basis. So we can just kind of go off the top of our head with writers we just really admire and respect. And yeah, I would say that it's an art, not a science. And in fact, I think the more scientifically you approach it, the worse the match ends up being. I think everyone in this room knows the perils of like a too on the nose pairing. Sometimes if it's just too obvious, it's really not the right pairing. But yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo everything MJ said. And I think it's just a naturally kind of meandering responses because it's so personal and so case by case. And a lot of it is, trial and error. I don't want to say error, but you really just never know what you're going to get when you assign it to a reviewer. It's never our job to tell them what to think of the book. So it's always a kind of interesting surprise to see what this really respected writer made of it.
Yeah, I think that element of surprise is really important to me when I really do not know what the writer is going to think, but I think that they will thoughtfully engage with the book. And I think it's especially tough on nonfiction because you want to have someone who has a little bit of expertise and knowledge of the subject matter, and yet isn't a direct competitor, isn't a scholar of, say, the same exact field of studies, or hasn't written a book that is too similar to that of the book under review. So you want them to speak knowledgeably and yet without having a kind of dog in the race. And I find that especially on books that are controversial or political, it's a lot harder to find reviewers who you can say will look at a book beyond just, ticking a box, I agree or I disagree, and just kind of thoughtfully and independently engage with the subject matter.
I think that's a really critical point, that we don't want to know beforehand or have an idea or suspect what a reviewer thinks of the book before we assign it to them. A lot of times I just think like, who will tell me something thoughtful and interesting about it? And I feel like I find various ways of evaluating that. I had a review recently that I assigned to a reviewer, and I just thought, they write about tension very well. What they've written about has nothing to do with the subject matter of this book, but they write about tension very well. And I felt very tense while reading this. And I'm curious to know what they think about that too. Or another time I thought, this reviewer just tells a really good yarn in life. I've read the other stories and their tweets and their essays, and they just tell a really funny story. And I think they could do something really fun with this book, whether it's a fun book or not. I think they'll just turn this review into a really interesting yarn that will connect with readers. And I think that's at the end of the day, the most important thing. We're trying to figure out who will connect with readers the most and tell readers something so unexpected, thoughtful, charming, authoritative about a book at hand.
It really requires us all of the previewers doing a lot of reading, right? I mean, that's just how we find out that these people exist and try to kind of expand our stable of reviewers. So we're just, reading other reviews, essays, anything online, lots of books. I think that's another benefit of there just being, more than a handful of us, of previewers. The fact that if I have a reviewer who does a really excellent job on, say, a literary novel, and then I just happen to find out through conversation, email, Twitter, something that reviewer happens to have this really obscure background interest in some, I don't know, aspect of the medical field. Or I think there was a reviewer who I found out was really into bugs. And I passed her along to our colleague who previews science books and books on, insects and things like that. Just, in case he ever finds something, because how else would you know that these people have these alternate interests that they haven't necessarily written about? So it's really fun. It's very fun and collaborative.
All right, here is another question. Give us the names that you feel have been lost in the mix, books that deserved much more attention than they received. And this comes from someone on Twitter who goes by the handle Bookmaniac, appropriately.
Well, I just wrote an essay on the late Randall Keenan, who passed away a year ago. And, I think he was known, he was a Southern writer. He was born and ended up spending most of his life in North Carolina. And so, he was known in regional circles, definitely more in the South. But, I shamefully, and I think, others I've spoken to in kind of our world just didn't know enough about him. And I've just been kind of binging his novel and fiction and nonfiction. He was very prolific over the course of his life. He just passed away last year. And it's remarkable. He's a magical realist. He's a historian. He was a professor. He's just a really fascinating writer. More people should read him and appreciate him. So I really recommend his work.
How did you discover him?
Well, I'm spending a lot of time down in North Carolina these days, and a lot of people are just singing his praises to me, and so I want to share that with more people.
All right, MJ, how about you? Who deserves more praise than they get?
This is one of my favorite questions because at the end of the year, like we're always trying to like look back and think like, oh yeah, this book. I want to talk with more people about this book, or like I feel like the end of the year is a good time to be reflective and to champion things. And so I love this question. So two books came to mind for me. The first was this book, and I kind of grounded this question by books that came out this year that I just wanted to resurface. So the first book that came to mind was this book, Poppy Show by Leon Ross, which was this novel that I thought was just so charming and so absorbing. It's about this magical island called Poppy Show where everyone has like these like powers to do small things. One person can heal others. One person can tell when other people are lying. And at the core, there is this person who has to make one perfect meal for every single person on this island. And this particular person this time around is gifted with the ability to perfectly flavor food with just the touch of his hands. And what follows is this novel and this story about this island preparing for this upcoming disaster, this hurricane on the way. But it's told through this incredibly sensuous descriptions of food and togetherness and life on this island. It was the perfect escape for me. It was like 2021. We were in lockdown. We got more freedom as the summer and vaccines came out. But no matter what, I feel like we were still living in these like kind of restricted worlds. And Poppy Show was so expansive, and I wanted to talk to more people about it. And now I get to bring it back up. The other book that I thought of was Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. This has gotten some acclaim, but I wanted to have a wider readership. It is about a trans woman named Reese who is approached by her ex to raise her ex's and her ex's new partner's baby. The ex, his name is Amos, but he was assigned male at birth, transitioned to live as a woman, and then detransitioned and is now living as a man. And he realizes that he doesn't want to have a traditional family structure with this baby. And so he's like, how about we kind of make this other family, this extended larger family, and that by default kind of expands what this family can be. I think this had a lot of acclaim and a readership in queer communities, but I think it's just a fantastic book. Tori Peters writes tremendously about power. Watching Tori Peters kind of go in and out of the dynamics and structures of an argument is magnetic. It's like watching a game of volleyball or tennis. You just see these characters lob one attack versus the other and then calculate what's going to get and destabilize someone else. And it's unparalleled. It's such a tremendous book, and I think it should have the widest readership there is. And so those are two books that I think kind of got buried a little bit that I want to kind of bring back out.
All right, here is one last question. This comes from Lauren Abel in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania. She writes, I was interested in the question from one of your readers discussed during the December 24th podcast about whether the novel is dead and the responses of the critics. One thought that I had that I don't think was fully explored was not whether the novel was dead, but whether nonfiction was dead. If there's one thing that was hammered home during the last 4 years, it was that truth or nonfiction can be, let's say, edited so that it can in the telling have elements of fiction. Thoughts on this, Lauren?
I love this question. And one of the things I noticed in her actual writing of the question is that she put fiction and nonfiction in quotation marks, which I just think is a really a telling choice. I would not in any circumstance say that nonfiction is dead, nor would I say that fiction is dead. But I think we all have questions about the rigidity of the distinction. And I think we're seeing that more and more with books that really do blur the line. I'm thinking of Colm Toibin's The Magician, his novelization of the life of Thomas Mann, and questions around why would you fictionalize a biographical story as fiction. Or I'm also thinking about Benjamin Labatut's How We Cease to Understand the World, how there's a real blurring of that distinction between historical fact, historical people, historical lives, and real poetic license that actually just magnifies, enhances the story. And I think Lauren is totally right. Every nonfiction book, as rigid as the story seems to be told, does, of course, contain some elements of, the author's point of view in some way is going to color the story, and in the same vein, fiction writers are always going to take their material from somewhere. So I guess I wouldn't say either genre is dead, just that maybe the distinction between them is blurring, dying.
MJ, thoughts?
So two things. I also love this question because I feel like so often we're like, is the novel dead? What is its impact? Nonfiction does not get that same existential reconsidering, and I'm glad we get to do it here. Nonfiction, you're up. I actually feel very strongly about this, that number one, nonfiction is not dead at all. And I feel very strongly about whether the line can be blurred for nonfiction specifically. I think fiction is so expansive, and those books Lauren mentioned, I think, blur so perfectly and so artfully facts with fictitious elements, but we continue to call them novels, and I think that's so critical. I think that for nonfiction specifically, we are making, when we label something nonfiction, a basic claim that these are facts. And I think you can tell them with the energy and verve of fiction, but I think that essential thing cannot change. That when you say something is nonfiction, we are saying that it is factually true. And I think that when the truth is edited to contain elements of fiction, that basic truth claim disappears. It is no longer nonfiction. I think it may sit somewhere in between. I think it's fine to call it fiction. The reader expectation needs to be different when you are conceding that you have edited the basic facts. I also think that a lot of times we talk about how nonfiction reads like fiction these days, or certain books. I'm thinking about Patrick Radden Keefe's book, Say Nothing, and Empire of Pain, or I'm thinking of Bad Blood. Those books pull you in like novels do. But I think still very critically, those are still factually based books. The difference is in the styling. It's different in how we tell the story, but not necessarily the basic facts of the story, or it doesn't kind of like wiggle with the truthfulness of the facts of the story. So I don't think that nonfiction is dead. I do think that the way we style nonfiction is like shifting, and I think in very interesting and critical ways. But for me, nonfiction will continue to exist because we will continue to have stories and books that are telling readers what happened here is factually true and that is unwavering.
I guess it's a distinction of degrees, right? Between something that is fabricated, fictionalized, and something that just contains elements of subjectivity, right? Because of course you can, set the reader up to expect a level of journalistic veracity, for example. But at the end of the day, it's kind of a legal distinction, right? Like fiction doesn't need to be rigorously fact-checked because the audience isn't expecting strict adherence, whereas nonfiction, as subjective as something might be, it does need to be checked by many other eyes for some kind of adherence to the truth.
All right. Food for thought. That is for Lauren Abel in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, and to MJ Franklin and Lauren Christensen. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Pamela.
Our intrepid reporters, Liz Harris and Alexandra Alter, join us now. Hey, guys.
Hi. Hey.
All right. We've got questions for you. These are questions from our listeners and from our readers. And I'm going to start with a question from Justin Wager, who asks, how does the whole practice of discounted books work? I'm referring to books you buy from book outlets that have a pen mark on the bottom of the book to indicate, I think, that the books were returned to the publisher unsold. Then how do book outlets get them for resale? How does this whole thing work? I recently bought a copy of Alex Ross's latest book on Wagner, recently reviewed by NY Times Book Review, at a book outlet with a mark on the book, but it only recently came out. Curious. Over to you.
It's a very common practice for retailers to discount books, and that's, common on Amazon. It's common at Barnes & Noble. In those instances, the retailers themselves are the ones eating the discount, not the publisher, not the author. It helps them to get, more copies sold, and it turns out to be a good business practice. In terms of the kind of discounted book that you're describing, that our listener is describing, it sounds like possibly this was a used copy, maybe something that somebody purchased, read, and returned, decided they had either read it or didn't want to read it and had returned it. It doesn't sound like it was a remaindered copy that went back to the publisher and was then later sold, because typically remaindered copies that go back to a publisher because nobody wants to buy them. And so those aren't the kind of copies that turn up in used bookstores or the kind of books that get discounted even though they're new releases, because publishers and booksellers agree that these are books that a lot of people are going to want to buy, and they're going to encourage them by offering them a lower price, like you see at the discount table at Barnes & Noble, or the heavily discounted titles that are new that you see on Amazon.
The books that go back, don't they get pulped, right? Someone once told me they get turned into toilet paper sometime. I don't know if that's true, but that made me very sad.
I think Stephen King's band's name was the Rock Bottom Remainders, which of course is not a problem that Stephen King has, but yeah, it is typical when the books are remaindered, they do get pulped. It's basically everybody giving up that anyone's ever going to want to buy those copies. So I don't think that's what we're talking about, but I'd be curious. So it sounds like you the listener scored a newish copy of an Alex Ross book. So congrats on that.
There's also a lot of free copies of brand new books that are sent out as part of the publicity campaign for a new book. So it's quite possible, too, that some of these books were then turned over by people who maybe got a free copy as part of what's called a big mouth campaign, or the copies were sent to radio stations, to TV programs, and then people there sold them to bookstores, which then resold them to customers. Let's move on to a question from Jeff Anderson. He is lifting a question from By the Book and asks, what book or books would people be surprised to find on your bookshelves? Liz Harris, what have you got?
Let's see. I don't know if it's a surprise, but I have like a real high-low thing. I have some Emily Dickinson and some Ada Limon, who's a wonderful poet. This isn't low, but it's a very different kind of thing. I also have some YA. I have Last Night at the Telegraph Club, which won the National Book Award this year for YA. I'm very excited about it. We also have a lot of books about horses in my house because my 6-year-old really likes horses. So lots about horses if you want to learn.
Got it. What about you, Alexandra?
I have, it might be unusual, a small collection of books in Sanskrit because I dabbled in Sanskrit in college. I'm not so good at reading it anymore, but I kept the books because they're hard to come by. So I have those, and a ton of galleys, as you might expect. So stuff that's not out yet, or stuff that came out a while ago, but I have earlier versions like we all get, and so that we can read early copies. And sometimes those versions change slightly over time. So that's fun. And I, like Liz, love YA as well. So now that my kids are getting a little older, they're reading some of that too. But I love John Green. My daughter has devoured the Twilight series, so we have those. Great range of books around here.
I'm impressed by anyone who even dabbles in Sanskrit, Alexandra. All right.
It really was dabbling.
Here's another question. This one came through Twitter from a Twitter user, MSP. What book received widespread acclaim at its release and is now considered as unworthy of its accolades?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this question like a politician and answer the question I want to answer instead of the question that was asked. So the book review did this great feature recently about classics that are, now considered just these incredible parts of the canon that were completely panned by the book review, like Catch-22, the book review hated, Anne of Green Gables, the book review hated. What are some other good ones? Let me see. Some stuff by Sartre got really panned. The Voyage Out by Virginia Woolf. Let's see. Aside from a certain cleverness, which, being all in one key, palls on one after going through 100 pages of it, there is little in this offering to make it stand out from the ruck of mediocre novels, which make far less literary pretension. That would be Virginia Woolf.
Ooh, brutal.
All right, here is another question. What, in your opinion, was the most underrated title of the last year?
Ooh, can I do one from 2020? Because I loved it so much and I felt like it really needed more attention.
Yes, you give a politician's answer too, Alexandra.
The novel Piranesi by Susanna Clarke is absolutely extraordinary, mind-blowing. What she does inside a person's head is insane, and I loved it, and I think everyone should read it. But yeah, it came out right, mid-pandemic, and I think didn't get the kind of acclaim it might have or recognition if she'd been able to go out and promote it more, or if people had been, running around to their independent bookstores, which were really excited about it. So I hope everyone checks that book out.
All right, here's a question. You'll solve a mystery for Jacob Lupfer, who asks this question via Twitter. How do authors of their first novels get a bazillion famous people to blurb and promote them? Good agents? Eager publishers? Is it family and relationship connections? Or are they actually the best of the best among achiever, attainer, meritocratic debut novelists?
Ooh, so there's a whole network of ways that you get a bazillion, as he put it, blurbs as a debut novelist, but often this eagerness to acquire blurbs will be in proportion to the size of your advance. And the size of your advance may have something to do with your agent. And so typically the agent will have other big authors they represent. They will say, hey, we've got this great new book. Can you blurb it? The publisher likewise will comb through their list of authors and say, can you blurb this book? I mean, once you've covered the publishing industry for a long time, when you see a particular author on a particular book, you look at who's publishing it and you say oh, I see, or you look at the agent and you can tell. But sometimes it's just an extraordinary novel. And sometimes they will send out early copies and actually get organically great responses. So I think it does vary, but there certainly is a network effect that takes place. And I think particularly when publishers have made a big investment in a new author, they really need to signal not only to readers, but to critics and to media outlets that are going to cover the book, everyone's getting behind this novel. Look at these amazing authors who have put their names on these blurbs to say, check this new person out. So
it becomes a kind of group effort, right? It's like the agent will ask other clients that they represent to chip in with some blurbs, especially if the author is totally unknown. And the editor will ask people they know, and the publicist might ask people they know. And then, of course, with unknowns, if they've gotten an MFA in particular, then they will ask their teachers, their professors. So you can see, for example, if someone went to Syracuse, they have a George Saunders blurb potentially, or if someone went to Iowa, there are lots of great professors out there. So you can kind of do a little investigation to figure out the origin of the blurbs.
Yes, exactly. And one kind of somewhat new thing that I've heard a lot of authors and agents complaining about is there's now pressure for authors to get blurbs before their book is published. So if they're submitting a manuscript to publishers, they now feel like they have to get blurbs for the book in advance to sort of say,
that's hell.
I know. I know. It's annoying for the people that are constantly getting blurb requests. It's extremely annoying for the authors who feel they have to collect all these accolades before they've even been published or edited or anything like that. But I've certainly heard complaints about this happening more and more.
All right, here is another question. This one comes from Damara McAndrew, who hails from Brisbane, Australia. And Damara asks, I'd like to know how many books you all read each year and what proportion are for work versus for pleasure.
I would say the majority of my reading is for work, just because in order to keep up with everything new that's coming out, to look for emerging literary trends, to just keep track of what publishers are putting out, I have to do a lot of reading. I don't finish everything I pick up, for sure. A lot of the time I will pick up a book and think this fits into a story I'm working on, or maybe it doesn't. But that ends up being, book a week typically or more if I'm skimming. And, that's dozens of books a year. And then every once in a while, I'll let myself go back and read something that came out a while ago that I missed that everyone loved. And that's always fun. This year I read, even though it wasn't a book that I was writing about or an author that I was writing about this year, I read Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun, and I absolutely loved it.
I love that book. That was so good.
It's so good.
Liz, how about you? How many books do you read a year? Give us a number.
2 different categories: the skims for work that you have to decide whether or not you are going to read, or that kind of thing. Yeah, dozens, I would say. And then for myself, I don't know. I listen to books too. So I tend to listen to nonfiction and read fiction, though I also read some nonfiction, but I tend to never listen to novels. A couple dozen, probably, I'm going to guess 30-ish for myself this year, 35, 30.
Are you both fast readers?
Yeah, I would say I am. We're all reading less than Obama, though, which is kind of disturbing because I know he has other things to do, including writing volume 2 of his memoir.
Right. He's reading to avoid writing.
I'm very familiar with that practice. Yes.
Yeah.
We endorse. All right. One final question. How do you track the books you read? Do you use a journal or Goodreads or something else?
I have a Google Doc.
Ooh, that's clever. I'm going to steal that idea.
Yeah, it's very good. I only started doing it a couple years ago, which is very frustrating to me because I look back and I'm like, I only have 3 years of this. I want to know all of them. Because Pamela, you've kept track forever and I'm very jealous of your initiative.
Yeah, that's my one thing I've kept track of. Everything else is completely lost to the winds. Also, I should credit that question to Umar Ahmed, who emailed that question in. What about you, Alexandra? What's your current method?
Well, now I'm realizing I don't have a system and I better create one quickly. I read a lot of my books for work on my Kindle. I get NetGalleys, and I like that because it's easily searchable for fact checking and I can make all the highlights and notes in there. And so I have everything kind of electronically. But when I do read in print, I have no system for keeping track of it besides piles around the house. So maybe I'll try to emulate you two and get some kind of system going.
The piles make my wife so mad. There's so many piles.
Tune in next year to find out if Alexandra took up the Google Doc system. Liz, Alexandra, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.